Hi folks, you're with Tassless today, your pushback channel, and thank you for joining this audio live stream. Please listen to this live stream as you would a radio broadcast. In this essay, I'd like to talk about how ideologically based government is completely different from democratic based government. Now, when I say democracy, I don't mean the sort of the rather churlish argument that some people put up to say, well, America is not a democracy, it's a republic. But you get to fucking vote, so it's a democracy, all right? Now, maybe a democratic republic, but it's still a fucking democracy. So, and you get to vote between different parties, or did. I get to vote between different parties with different prescriptions, perhaps, or varying descriptions on how to run the nation and run the economy and selection of priorities and implementation of those priorities and so on. Now, ideology is quite different. Democracy is a sharing of power, and democracy, by its very nature, you must persuade people to vote for you, and you have to persuade them to vote for you by saying, well, we've got better policies than those other guys. We're going to do this and do that, or we're going to do better things. So we're going to do what we've listened to the people, and we're going to respond. Now, in terms of sort of micro detail of how to run the financials of a country or so on, the people can't decide on that. So the people are deciding on the bigger policy issues, on what they want. The details of the implementation are quite different. So if the people say, well, we don't want mass migration, then that's it. The elected representatives stop the mass migration. And they may say, well, we need those workers. So what we have to do now is find another way of achieving our object. Let's say we're bringing in the mass migration supposedly to provide more, nurses or something like that. So for example, the government said, well, the people don't want mass migration, so I have to stop that. But we still need more nurses. That doesn't go away. So we need to find another way of achieving that. I know, says one of the government people, let's open up some nurse training schools and we'll train more nurses here. Great idea. Okay, problem solved. So the problem, assuming it is even a problem in the first place, can be solved in a different way. But the big ticket issues, the broader issues are decided by the people, and the people's elected representatives are meant, of course, to represent the people and implement the wishes of the people in those bigger issues. The details, sure, are going to be up to the professionals, but the bigger, we don't want mass migration, we don't want this climate change, no, we don't want to be paying more for energy and so on. This is something that the people want. So a government that was democratic would deliver on that. So the democracy is you share power and you accept different points of view. Now, if other people have a point of view that you don't agree with or incompatible with the sort of policies the government's pursuing, or the mass of the people want to pursue, then you would attempt to persuade others. You wouldn't put them in prison or take them out back and shoot them or call them Nazis or something. You'd attempt to persuade them. And you'd say, well, I want to explain my policies and why it's better, or why it's better than the other guys. So democracy is about sharing power, and it's about persuasion. Also, it's about transfer of power, so that if the other guys win the election, that is, the will of the people's been expressed, then you've got this orderly changeover of power, that the new guys coming in, they are now the legitimate government of the fully legitimate, and they've been legitimised fully at the ballot box by the people. So this is what democracy is. Now, it's not perfect, and as I think Winston Churchill once said, it's not perfect. It's just the best system we've got. Or it's imperfect, but all the others are worse, I think, maybe, or words to that effect at least. And I think that's true. Democracy does have its shortcomings, but so do the others. Now, ideological government is quite different. Ideological government is imposed. It doesn't seek to persuade the people. It doesn't seek to win people over with the rational argument. It's to what extent it attempts to win people over at all. It's by deceit, so running a narrative. So in order to persuade people, you've got to say, well, no one else is allowed to have a point of view like the narrative through the media. No one else is allowed to speak. No one else is allowed to have a voice. Only our propaganda, only our position is allowed to be heard. Now, that's that's imposing a form of persuasion. So it's hardly sharing power, and you're not very confident in your ideas if your views or the way you want to do things if no one else is allowed to speak, and that's the only way you can get your views to be accepted by the public or somewhat accepted, because there's no other views. Now that's the ideological way. We're not going to compete with ideas because we're not going to share power. We've got no intention of sharing power. We will impose our ideological will on the people, and no one else is allowed to have a voice except for us. And deceit is our only weapon, or shutting down the opposition, deplatforming them, or whatever the case may be, deleting their videos and so on. So that's classic ideology. Ideology is not going to share power. It will not share power, and it has no intention of allowing alternative points of view. Any alternative point of view or any other idea or even questions are threats to ideological power, and they won't accept it, and they're not accepting it. And whatever they're accepting or having to tolerate in say, the US because of the First Amendment, they're desperately trying to get, the globalists are desperately trying to get around that by having, special secretive government units and nudge units working in cahoots in background, working in cahoots with, social media platforms and so on. They already control the mainstream media. The mainstream media wouldn't exist without government financing. So without government support, being given taxpayer money to run the globalist line, the ideological globalist line, they wouldn't exist. So if it was a market-driven thing, none of these places would be in business. And so the main propaganda delivery systems that the globalists are able to use, laced wall to wall with deceit and lies and misrepresentations, they're that conduit to controlling the public perceptions on things. That would be gone, and that the marketplace of ideas would blow wide open, and it could drastically change the landscape in terms of the globalist program. So they can't have that. They won't allow it. Now, looking at ideology in terms of political power, and through elections and the representatives of the people that are supposedly in parliaments. Now, again, ideological government or ideological control, ideological imposition, call it what you will, it cannot tolerate opposition. It has no framework for tolerating that. Ideological government is one-party state, and they force their ideology on people. They're not persuading anybody. Do what the fuck you're told, you fucking peasant motherfucker. And if you don't agree with us, you're a damn fucking Nazi and you're Hitler. And they use all these names. And just if you look recently, say in the last couple of days in Germany, the government there, which is 100% globalist controlled, the government there wants to, or the idea is being floated at least, of outlawing their main political opposition. I just want you to sort of consider this for a moment. The bigger outside of the governing elite in a supposedly democratic state, something approaching a quarter of the citizens, and I'd say that's being watered down and doctored as well, something approaching a quarter of the citizens are voting for a party that is opposed to globalization and opposed to the ideology of globalization. So they are now the enemy, and it cannot be accepted. Ideological government cannot accept any opposition or any alternative point of view. If that's the one takeaway from this essay, take that away. So the further we go down the globalist path, the further we go down the ideological path, and the further we go down the one-party state, where no opposition and no alternative views, not even questions, will be permitted. So the German government is considering banning and outlawing their own opposition in their own country. And the fucking chutzpah of this, they're claiming that it's a measure they're going to take to protect democracy. It's hard to believe. I'm looking at things. That's got to be a definition of insanity coming out with nonsense like that. Now, the enemies of democracy are the ones imposing the ideology. not the the opposition party in Germany, and they're branded as right wing and far right and this and that. Next thing, they're nothing of the sort. They just say, well, if you want to do the alternative energy thing, that's fine. The green energy thing, that's fine, but only if it doesn't increase the cost to German households of their energy bills. Nothing wrong with that. That's hardly radical. That's far from radical. That's not even remotely radical. The next thing that they have is that mass migration, unless it's skilled migrants to speak German, shouldn't be, only skilled migrants to speak German should be permitted to migrate to Germany. Nothing wrong with that. That's all fine. That's nothing radical in that at all. Not even slightly radical. And the German citizens should get preference over foreigners that arrive illegally and so on in terms of social services. Nothing wrong with that. That is not even remotely radical. Now, just for those positions, they're branded as far right and fascist and this and that, the next thing, and this talk of outlawing them. The real issue, of course, that they're opposed to globalization. And because they're now a major force, or becoming a major political force in Germany, there's general panic in the ranks that their ideology will be under threat by a major political party, and that political party, particularly given the way things are going at the moment in Europe, there's this growing sort of resistance to the globalist ideological project. They think that if by outlawing them, their main political opposition, that they will protect the ideology, and that's their sole aim. And we need to just understand, even in Australia, there was a politician that was getting quite a lot of popular support and a lot of people turning up for the rallies, political rallies, and speech nights, things like that. And what the globalist controlled forces did at the time, they made sure that politician was arrested on some very, very vague technicalities. An activist judge was assigned to hear the case, and they were put in prison just because they opposed the globalist ideology. That's it. Nothing. They committed no crime. Just that, and that they were popular. You can sort of be opposed to the globalist ideology, but if they can marginalise you by calling you names and things like that, and you're not a threat, then they kind of don't care. You're just an irritation. But if you start to get a decent following, as this party is in Germany, that's when they hit the panic button and say, well, we've got to do now. The pattern is always the same, and I'm very concerned about it. As soon as you become a real threat to the ideology, and they can't just easily dismiss you and shut you down, which they say can do with a social media, somebody who's got a big social media presence. If they can't do that, then they'll go to the next stage, which is arranging to put you in prison, and even the next stage beyond that is if you've got too much knowledge of things that would be harmful to the players in the game, then they can arrange to have you murdered, even in a prison, for goodness sakes. Look at Jeffrey Epstein. Now, looking at coming back to Australia, that politician was put in prison simply for opposing globalisation. They'd committed no crime. And then we had a prime minister who was increasingly suggesting that the cost of living was increasing at a much faster rate than wages, and this was not a good thing for Australian citizens. And he was advocating that the Green New Deal thing would be scaling back on that because it was adding too much cost to the household energy bills. And he also was looking at reducing or changing the mix of migration to only be skilled people that could speak English and coming to Australia. Of course, stopping illegal migration and those sort of things. Now, he had this outrageous view that he actually represented the Australian people who voted for him in a supposedly democratic election and so on. Or I don't doubt it was a democratic election, but he believed it was a democracy and that the government represented the people. That's what this guy believed. And so none of his ideas were, he was attacked for being a Nazi and all this sort of stuff, but none of his ideas were anything resembling fair. He just thought, I represent the people of Australia who voted for me. That was it. They are my first priority. That was all. Nothing Nazi about that. And but he was again roundly attacked by the globalist controlled propaganda machine. And in the end, they managed to get their this guy's parliamentary colleagues to just get rid of him, just to say, nah, we don't want you anymore. Now, he'd stumbled a couple of times on minor things that were minor administrative things and symbolic things that were not relevant to anything really. I didn't think they were very smart, but not relevant to anything really. And but they used this of that was the reason why he had to go, which was bullshit. But for the purely just because he said, well, look, globalists, I actually represent the Australian people first. That's what I represent, and that's my first priority. Just for that, they got rid of him. So I just want to bring home here that ideological government or ideological power, when it's being imposed, and it is, cannot tolerate this sort of thing. You don't represent the people of Australia. You represent globalist ideology and our globalist ideological interests. That's what you represent. And if you think that you represent the Australian people, we'll just make sure you're not the Prime Minister anymore. So the elected Prime Minister, elected by the people, can just be airily dismissed because he's not a globalist protege. He's not a globalist flunky. That's where we're at now. So now look at the US, where they're relentlessly going after Donald Trump because they know they can't beat him. They cannot beat him in a fair election. They cannot. They know that. They know the people do not want the globalist ideology. They know that. So they say, well, we don't give a shit. We're imposing this ideology whether people want it or not. And why should we listen to those and share power? Those damn fucking Nazi peasants. And anyone that disagrees with us is a fucking Nazi. So, I mean, they're the Nazis, while having the chutzpah to accuse everyone else of being a Nazi. So this is the ideological situation we're in now. Ideological government is being imposed all across the Western world. And anything that threatens that or questions it is going to be brutally dealt with. We've reached, I think, the penultimate stage where they'll just outlaw political opposition that may be a threat to them, whether it's the Farmers' Party in Holland or whether it's the AfD in Germany or whatever it might be. If they can't rig the elections, I think it's too difficult to rig the elections to make sure these people are deemed as irrelevant. They're doing that, I think, in Britain now, for example. So they don't have to outlaw the political opposition there. They can just rig the election to make sure they only get 2 or 3% of the vote. But in Germany, they need to outlaw them if they're going to get rid of them. You can't have mass raids on all the political, the heavyweight political guys in the opposition who all happen to have 100 kilos of white powder in their lounge room at the second the police walk in the door. That would just look. You've got to do something else. You can say, well, they're just so bad, we have to outlaw them, and that's the path they're going down there. But that's the penultimate stage of outlawing or banning any opposition. The final stage, of course, is taking people out the back and shooting them, and I think we're close to that now. And I say that with much concern and with heavy heart and much regret. But I think we're not far away from that. The globalists, if they perceive they're under sufficient threat for their ideology, they will go to that stage. And I have no doubt about it. Looking at the idea of ideological struggles and banning political parties, the says, well, the Nazis banned the political opposition and so on. So therefore, and the communists banned it, and the East German government banned the political opposition, and so on. This is the Nazis were in ideological terms, the Nazis were sort of lower down the scale. They allowed private property, they allowed private enterprise, but it was in close cooperation with government to achieve national objectives, such as the Nazis building those highways and autobahns and that sort of thing, which is a very successful program, by the way. The communists were a little bit different. Their ideological imposition was everybody must think as we do. You have to think the same way, otherwise we'll kill you or imprison you. The Nazis didn't take such an extreme view. You still had freedom of religion, things like that, whereas with the communists you didn't. So nothing. If ideological government cannot accept any opposition of thought or practice or anything at all, no opposition is permitted. The Nazis, by contrast, were quite tolerant of religion, and again, the private sector, private companies could hire who they wanted, those sorts of things. You didn't have to have a political commissar on staff, whereas you did in in the communist countries. So the imposition of ideology is increasingly extreme in the West now as the globalists are tightening their grip on us all. And this stage of outlawing opposition and so on is just the next step in that, which demonstrates how bankrupt their ideology is, but how desperately determined they are to impose it, and they're prepared to accept any collateral damage in pursuit of those objectives. You've been with Tacitus today at your Pushback channel. Thank you for listening.
It doesn't look like we're going to get any rain.